Hi, I'm going to be going through verses written on her deathbed at Bath to her husband in London by Mary Monck. And this poem is particularly moving and emotional because Monck herself was writing on her true deathbed as she suffered from consumption at the time. And she was in Bath and writing to her husband George. She was in Bath because they believed that to be a place of restoration and good health. And this poem is her coming to terms with her oncoming death and speaking to her husband about her love, but also about how he can manage without her when she dies. So it's a really moving poem. One thing to note for your GCSE essays is that you still need to differentiate between the idea of a poet, which is Mary Monck putting on the words and the language choices and the structure. Those are her poetic choices, but she is different to the speaker. The speaker still has her own voice, and Monck is creating that personal voice. Okay, so I've split this poem into four, beginning with the speaker's addressed to her husband, moving to her description of death, and a moment where she talks about love and how that might resist and stop her from dying, and then finally her acceptance of death. You can also split it up into quatrains, so I'll pop this here. You can also see that there are 5 quatrains and the rhyming couplet at the end. But I'm going to talk about it as I had split up initially, because I think in that middle part there's lots that you can combine and talk about together. Okay, so the poem begins with this emotional and loving address to her husband. And it goes, "Thou who dost all my worldly thoughts employ, thou pleasing source of all my earthly joy, thou tenderest husband and thou dearest friend, to thee this first, this last adieu I send." Okay, so firstly we have the anaphora repetition of thou, obviously the archaic word for you, and that immediately puts the subject of this poet at the centre, and that is our speaker's husband, our speaker's lover, and so we know immediately that they are very important to the speaker. Thou who dost all my worldly thoughts employ, thou pleasing source of all my earthly joy, thou tenderest husband and thou dearest friend. So here it's very clear from the beginning of the poem the amount of love our speaker has for her husband, and the superlative is repeated. He is all of her worldly thoughts and all of her earthly joy, so he means a huge amount to her. And these images of worldly thoughts and earthly joy, he really is kind of her universe. He takes up everything about her, her thoughts and her joy. So the images that are given to us right at the beginning of this poem are particularly moving, and it makes the rest of the poem particularly emotional because we know immediately how much he means to her. Thou tenderest husband and thou dearest friend. So these descriptions of the husband, again we have the repetition of the use of superlatives. So he is both the tenderest and the dearest. He is her husband and he is her friend. So he is everything to her. To thee this first, this last adieu I send. So this last goodbye I send to you. So the poem opens with this very loving address to her husband, and then we move instantly to the next line, which could be quite shocking, particularly if you haven't read the title of the poem. At length the conqueror, death, asserts his right. So we might at the beginning assume that this is a simple love letter, and we realise with that image, a metaphor of death, that this is much more than that, and this is actually her final goodbye to him. At length, the conqueror, death, asserts his right. So here we obviously have the metaphor and the personification of death. So death is a conqueror, so death becomes created into kind of a metaphorical battlefield, perhaps the enemy. And death is personified as well, suggesting kind of how powerful it is and how it has or it will overcome her. And death asserts his right. So that verb there, asserts, again links to the personification of how powerful death is. And it is death's right that she should die. It is kind of all in death's power. And so our speaker is perhaps feeling powerless. There is nothing she can do about her inevitable death. At length the conqueror, death, asserts his right and will forever veil me from thy sight. So I'm just going to remove some of this so this is slightly easier to make notes with. So, will forever veil me from thy sight. So that image there and that metaphor is quite interesting, because to veil the speaker from the sight of the husband is actually quite a gentle action. So the verb veil is quite gentle. It suggests a kind of a caring almost taking of her, and will forever veil me from my sight. So that temporal reference there, forever, reminds us that this is not temporary, it's a permanent action. He woos me to him with a cheerful grace. Okay, so now we're really developing this image of death being very different from the traditional perspective. So death is cheerful and he is wooing her. So it's almost like she has another partner, another love that is taking her from him. So there's a much more positive image being created of death. And perhaps that's to reassure her husband that she will be okay, that it isn't this painful, fearful thing that will happen to her, but something gentle and loving, that she will be okay. He woos me to him with a cheerful grace, and not one terror clouds his meagre face. So again, the lines that follow are of a similar language technique and a similar meaning. So no terror, we've got the absence of terror that clouds his meagre face, meagre being kind of lacking or thin, which again is quite a strange description there. Perhaps it is showing that he's not maybe as handsome as her husband, or perhaps she cannot even see his face, perhaps he does not have a face. So a stranger image there that's maybe not as positive. But not one terror clouds his meagre face. He promises a lasting rest from pain and shows that all life's fleeting joys are vain. So again, the verbs that we're getting that describe death in green, woos and promises and shows and tells me, these are all again gentle verbs. There's no aggression. To be promised and showed and wooed are almost like she is creating a relationship with death. He promises a lasting rest from pain. Okay, and that all life's fleeting joys are vain. So death is actually bringing her comfort, bringing her a pain-free existence, which she cannot have if she lives. That all life's fleeting joys are vain. The eternal scenes of heaven he sets in view and tells me that no other joys are true. Okay, so we have death showing her heaven, showing her the eternal scenes of heaven, and telling her that no other joys are true. So that kind of her happiness that she thinks exists on earth, actually it's not true. And when she gets to heaven, she'll see what truly is kind of joyful. Okay, and then we have the pivot, but love. And so we have a moment here where things change slightly, and our speaker perhaps turns and has a different feeling for death, even though death has been cheerful and kind and caring to her as it tries to take her away. This is a moment, and the next 4 lines are a moment where our speaker seems to resist, and she refers to love. But love, fond love, would yet resist his power. So again, love is personified, but interestingly, it's not capitalized like death is, which perhaps show it's not as strong, it's not as powerful as death without that capitalization. But love, fond love, would yet resist his power. So we meet kind of the opposition of this metaphorical battlefield, and that is love. Would feign a while and defer the parting hour. So interestingly, love would defer the parting hour for a while, but that again is still temporary. And compared to the reference to the eternal scenes of heaven, it's clear that death is simply inevitable. Whilst love might put it off for a moment, it won't be able to last longer than death. He brings thy morning image to my eyes, and would obstruct my journey to the skies. So here the subject of he, we can assume now, is love rather than death. And love brings the image of her husband grieving to our speaker's eyes. And that's the thing. And that verb there, obstruct, is perhaps the strongest verb that we've had so far. So love would obstruct her journey to heaven. And then we have the end stop there, which signifies kind of the final meaning of that and the final emotion that she has. And then we have the repetition and another pivot. So we as a reader know that will change. Something will change again, the tone will change, or the deeper meaning will change again. But say, thou dearest, thou unwearied friend. So here, the poem changes by her directly addressing her husband once more, and repeating similar terms of affection with the superlative dearest, and the fact that he is her unwearied friend. So he is a friend that is not perhaps as tired and as unwell as she is. And she asks him to say, and she repeats say, and we have that imperative almost like she's imploring or pleading him. But say, should thou grieve to see my sorrow's end? Thou knowest a painful pilgrimage I've passed, and would thou grieve that rest is come at last? Okay, so we have here obviously the repetition of 2 questions. And so the tone becomes much more curious as our speaker seems to kind of ponder how her husband will feel and whether he should grieve her. Should thou grieve to see my sorrow's end? So should you be sad to see my pain go? So she's now questioning the reason for grief. And perhaps here is her final acceptance that she must die and that it is okay. Should thou grieve to see my sorrow's end? Thou knowest a painful pilgrimage I've passed. So we have the 2 images here of her sorrows and her painful pilgrimage. And we've got the first time that we have the repetition, the alliteration of the plosive P there, which really emphasizes kind of perhaps even like an anger here or a strong feeling that emphasizes her own pain. A painful pilgrimage I've passed. And should thou grieve, that rest is come at last. So should you be sad that I'm finally going to be okay? Her questions to her husband. And then we have the final couplet of the poem. And similarly to a sonnet structure, this is where our speaker finds a solution and ends the poem on a somewhat hopeful and positive tone. Rather rejoice to see me shake off life. Okay, so that rather is her solution. So do not grieve me, do not grieve my loss, but instead rejoice. And that verb rejoice suggests to celebrate, to find happiness. To see me shake off life. And that's, again, a really interesting verb choice from our poet. That if she is to shake off life, there's an element of energy there. That in her death, perhaps she is energized and she returns to a kind of a movement that she would have had in her life when she wasn't sick. Rather rejoice to see me shake off life. And actually going back to that verb, maybe that's such a quick movement and a careless movement that maybe her death isn't going to be long and painful and hard. It's a simple, energetic movement and it will happen. Rather rejoice to see me shake off life and die as I have lived, thy faithful wife. So I think for the first time in this poem, we no longer have a euphemism for death, but we have the direct phrasing of it. So we have that direct verb and die. So here there are no longer euphemisms, and before we've had things like sorrow's end, painful pilgrimage, parting hour. We've had lots of different euphemisms throughout this poem, and now we have the direct verb choice of die, which suggests maybe an acceptance of her death. Okay. Rather rejoice to see me shake off life and die as I have lived. So we have that contrast there. To die as I have lived, thy faithful wife. And that's a really clever way of ending the poem, because it's almost like she's signing off her letter as his faithful wife. And so in her death, she remains what she always wants to be, and what has perhaps kind of moulded her character and her life to be his faithful wife. Okay, so that's a relatively brief overview of the poem, and of course there's much more to pick apart and interpret, so I recommend going through that one more time at least, and seeing now what your own interpretations of the poem are. Now that we've looked at language and we have a good understanding of the meaning of the poem, we can take a step back and look at the bigger picture and look at the structure and see if we can match the structure with the meaning of the poem. So as you read it, you will realise quite clearly that there are rhyming couplets throughout the poem, and these are full rhymes rather than half rhymes, and that clearly can suggest, or the potential effect of that, or symbolism of that, is to show the connection between the husband and the wife. If we have throughout this poem two lines connecting together and flowing together, it is perhaps symbolic of their love and their connection. And then another structural point, an obvious one to make, is obviously that this poem is one stanza. And so we might think why our poet didn't break up the stanza, even though, as we've spoken about before, there are some obvious ways that you could break this into a quatrain and then a final rhyming couplet. But she doesn't, and she keeps it in one longer stanza. So the potential interpretations for that might be to show kind of this continuous flow, continuity between maybe her life and death, that there are no breaks, that there are no disruptions, and maybe that shows a flow and a kind of a link between her life into her death. Okay, so now that we have a good understanding of the main language techniques and the main structural techniques, we now need to think about how we put this into a GCSE literature essay. And so you might start to think about the potential questions that CIE might give you for this poem. And one that often crops up is how does the poem explore the speaker's thoughts and feelings? So you might think about how you would break this poem up to show the poet's or the speaker's changing feelings. And that might be that initially it goes from kind of love and dedication, and then to kind of exploring her feelings of death and the inevitability of death, and then that moves to acceptance and reassurance to her husband. So that would create a comprehensive answer to that question. But CIE also like to ask questions such as, how is this poem particularly or strikingly moving and emotional? And that's a much broader question that you are given, and that gives you opportunities to come up with different essay structures, and talk about perhaps instead that it's moving and emotional because of her love for her husband at the beginning, so similar to the previous essay. And then perhaps it's moving and emotional because of the way that she depicts death. The depiction of death in a positive light is actually particularly moving and emotional, as the speaker's trying to get their kind of thoughts and feelings to accept the fact that this will happen to her. And then you might say that it's moving and emotional because of the inevitability of death. That could be a particularly nice paragraph to explore language and structure. And perhaps again it's moving and emotional because of her acceptance, and her attempt to reassure her husband is emotional in itself. Okay, so that is verses written on her deathbed at Bath to her husband in London. And as I said, there's lots more to analyse and interpret. So if you go away and look at that again and add some personal opinions of your own, that would create a very effective GCSE essay.